Let's start with the deal itself. 5-year deal, MOU that includes both male and female cricketers. The revenue share elements are there. Who's claiming the biggest victory here?
Well, my first impression was that Cricket Australia had been absolutely owned by the ACA, and it's my second and third impression too. The players have come out way on top in this. They've ended up with a deal that I think could almost have been struck after a week. And it makes you wonder what the carry-on of the last 10 months has been about, this endless kind of round your houses and atmosphere of kind of threat and fear and intimidation. The question now, one of the questions now is, you know, how does Australian cricket go forward? How do the players and the administrators coexist peacefully when they've been at loggerheads for such a long period?
How long do you think it will take for those fences to be mended?
Well, I think the history of Australian cricket, we've been indulged over the last 20 years by the progressive MOU agreements, and there's been an environment of relative peace and harmony. But their interests are not the same. They have to be brought together. The revenue share was a good way of containing the inherent pressures. It'll continue to do its work. Perhaps the players have been generally wakened to a sense of greater responsibility about the grassroots of the game, but I think they always had that in mind anyway. They're much, much closer to the grassroots than are directors of Cricket Australia.
I thought it was interesting during the press conference yesterday to hear the ACA CEO Alistair Nicholson talk about the ACA maintaining some of the players' intellectual property rights. What do you think that will mean in reality, and where does it leave Cricket Australia and its select sponsors?
It's a good point. There's always been a pretty informal relationship about IP in cricket. Basically, the cricketers sign over their IP to Cricket Australia in return for a portion of the player payment pool being devoted to the running of the Australian Cricketers Association. That's run on a kind of an entente cordiale, but when the players were basically internally exiled in the game, when their contracts were walked away from, they got their IP back. And they thought, well, I wonder what we do with it now. They didn't get terribly far down the line in exploring the various options. And it's clear to me that Mitchell Starc in an Australian jumper and Australian cap is a good deal more valuable than Mitchell Starc without. But at the same time, certain individuals do have a star power, a disproportionate star power, particularly in overseas markets like India.
Well, he's one of the players, isn't he, who's signed with a rival car company during this period of unrest. So it'll be very interesting to see how Cricket Australia deals with that going forward. Let's look at some of the positives, Gideon, because from a women's cricket perspective, this is a massive deal. Included on the MOU for the first time, it includes injury payments, retirement funds. How important is this for the future of women's cricket in Australia?
Well, it's a shame, actually. Yesterday could have been a great news story about women's cricket here. They've been excluded from previous MOUs. I don't think male players have always done the right thing by females, but they were absolutely solid in this dispute. In some respects, you know, Meg Lanning and Alex Blackwell and the female players group were the vulnerable flank of the ACA. If this argument had fissured along gender lines, which women's cricketers had a lot of incentive to go with that first CA offer, I think it would have been a big challenge for the ACA to surmount. As it is, by maintaining solidarity, they've made themselves a solid and equal partner with the men.
What about looking at it from an international perspective? We know English cricketers were keeping a very close eye on how these negotiations played out because of their own negotiations coming up at home. What do you think they will take from this outcome?
I think players all over the world are becoming accustomed to the idea of individual talent moving on a contractual basis to different tournaments around the world. Players' talents are much more portable than they used to be. This has been an interesting reminder of how formidable a players' collective is. We'd almost forgotten what a common consciousness of players looked like. I think even Cricket Australia's somewhat surprised that the players ended up being as shoulder to shoulder as they were. But when you step back a little bit, of course, players are always brought up to think that it's about the team and that they are expected to look to senior players, for an example. And if you looked across at the other guy in the dressing room from you and he was basically marching in step. It would have been a very independently minded player who'd walked away.
Certainly an example of player power. Gideon Haigh, thank you so much for having a chat with us this morning.
Thanks, Nick.